the Australian and Israeli embassies. And it became very clear to the CIA that imminent catastrophic attacks were going to go on, in addition to 9/11, that al-Qaeda had these things planned. And based on that, as we captured individuals, we didn't interrogate any of them at that point. We passed those people on to the military. Some of them were incarcerated in Guantanamo. But then months later, in July of, I believe 2002, was the first time, I guess, that the agency presented to the Congress its plans for the enhanced interrogation program. So, it took several months before these things were pulled together. And it was designed to collect information from senior terrorists who were believed to have critical information pertaining to imminent catastrophic attacks.
Just on the CIA was looking for. Right, on that point, you just described your own experience of getting crucial information. What techniques did you use, if any, to extract that information?
In that particular case, we provided medical care to an individual, and so of course it was a caring act on the part of the Americans and the British for that particular individual. But in other cases, and not there, but throughout the course of my career, whether it was the United States or foreign governments, interviewing or interrogating people, you see the case around the world where pressure is used, whether those individuals are, denied sleep or denied food and water for periods of time, and to put people under pressure, especially where individuals who are involved in major terrorist attacks.
So you dispute this conclusion that these techniques...
It doesn't work?
Exactly.
Well, let me just say this. There are two questions here. The first one is, does it work? And pressure, I believe, does work. The second issue is...
But there's levels of pressure, isn't there?
Is it a moral thing that we should do or not do? That's a second question. But the first question is, do these techniques work? Yes, they do work. They are effective. The second issue is, should a democracy be doing these things? That's the second issue.
And in terms of this report's release, does this make America a less secure place?
Well, I believe that the United States' position now vis-a-vis terrorist threats is one we are in greater threat now than we were 14 years ago. ISIS, Nusra Front, all the affiliated terrorist organizations, the expansion of terrorist acts around the world tenfold. It makes it, I believe, we live under greater threats. And the State Department in the United States has released, a threat warning to all embassies in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia that this impending report could result in additional levels of violence against the United States.
Gary
saying that it increases the risk.
Gary Benson, former CIA officer, thanks very much. We'll be hearing in a minute from a former senior advisor, legal advisor to the US State Department. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC.
Just for reading.
And coming up later on in the programme, giving Liberian children the true picture about corruption.
When the traffic finally moved forward, Opa drove right to the Opa rolled down the window slowly and Sundema and Sundega both noticed the clean $100 Liberian bills, which the police officer put in his pocket. He waved Opa's car through the traffic in a lane that was not there before.
Speaking to the author of the picture book that is appearing on school syllabuses in Liberia. That's in about 15 minutes. Reminder of our main headlines this hour. The United States Senate report says the CIA carried out brutal interrogations of suspects in the years after the September the 11th attacks. In some cases, amounting to torture. In a minute, we'll hear from Harold Coe, former legal advisor to the US State Department. You're listening to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. More now on that US Senate report into the CIA's interrogation techniques. And we'll get the view now of someone who wasn't until recently a senior US government lawyer. Harold Coe was legal advisor to the US State Department between 2009 and 2013. He's now a Sterling Professor of International Law at Yale. So, is there anything in this report we didn't know previously?
There were small things, but I think the big picture is I think it's now ended the so-called torture debate. There was a debate in America where some people said torture works, and this report very definitively proves it does not. It's ineffective. The claims for its effectiveness were misrepresented, and it has used cause. The program over and has been over since 2006. But those who would now defend it as wise or worth repeating should be ignored.
Does that mean America, the rest of the world, can be confident that it wouldn't happen again?
No, but great nations admit their mistakes.
Sometimes make them again?
I think if the history lessons are taught well, they don't make them again. The Brits had some horrible episodes historically, so did the U.S. And one reason to have these reports and educational experiences so people learn from them, accept responsibility, and learn from it.
With responsibility comes accountability, do you think?
Well, I think accountability often is in many forms. I think this will reawaken that discussion. There's been calls for a truth commission. I think this may well be as complete a truth commission report as you're going to see. We know now much more about the contours of the program and the overview of it than we did before.
Certain people, the UN Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism and Human Rights, the ACLU, the Centre for Constitutional Rights, and many others are now saying that people should be held accountable for what has happened. Do you agree with that?
Let's not talk about individuals.
Why not? Why not? It was individuals who signed off on this policy.
Because there's something much more important going on here. People torture people because they think there's a reason to do so and they think it works. This tells you it doesn't work. It's a mistake and it shouldn't be repeated again. And so if people were misled or people were evil, that's a secondary fact. But we've learned some important truth today, and I think that should be the message that people ought to focus on. People have tried to present as a moral tactic on the grounds that somehow, as a utilitarian matter, it works. That argument was today blown out of the water, and that is the story of the day, I think.
Yes, but you're a lawyer, and the other story of this is that it is illegal. Torture is illegal. So surely the question of prosecutions, the question of accountability is absolutely fundamental for America to move on.
I'm sure that's obviously there are many accountability mechanisms, and these groups that you've mentioned are perfectly capable and able to explore them. This is a time for prosecutorial officials to be charged as well as follow the facts. So that, it seems to me, will be an important outcome that will follow from this. But we won't know the outcome of that process for some time.
There wasn't a consensus on this. The Republicans withdrew from the process. The Republicans, come January, will be in the majority in the Senate. Can you really be sure that this draws a line under the arguments?
I think these arguments are delegitimated. You now have a 500-page report out. It seems to me quite thorough and convincing. I don't see what kind of arguments they're going to make. I think they've already lost this one in the court of public opinion.
That was Harold Coe, former U.S. State Department lawyer. Well, the Senate Intelligence Committee, which released the report today, was created in the 1970s to oversee the CIA and other intelligence agencies following a congressional investigation led to 14 reports detailing illegal CIA activity. While today's report was part of that oversight, but the intelligence committees is doing their job properly. Well, Elizabeth Goteen is director of the Liberty and National Security Program at New York University's Brennan Center for Justice. I asked her how much authority the Senate and House Intelligence Committees really have when it comes to the actions of the CIA.
They have a constitutional responsibility and authority to oversee the actions of the intelligence agencies. The problem is that the information they need to conduct oversight is in the possession of the program. They have to somehow pry that information out of the executive branch in order to conduct oversight. And that system has been badly broken.
Is there anything that can be done to change that?
There is something that can be done to change it, but it would require willingness on the part of the overseers to flex their muscle. For example, to declassify information. So the executive branch takes the position that only the executive can decide whether information should be classified or declassified. That is a very cramped reading of the Constitution. Unfortunately, members of Congress have not been willing up to this point to really push back against that.
So when Senator Feinstein concludes that the White House and indeed Congress have been lied to, had not been given the full picture by the CIA, is this slightly whitewashing the role of Congress or the lack of a role that Congress played in all of this?
I think that there's blame stingy, and not only stingy to its congressional overseers, but also misleading. I also think that members of the Senate are too willing to look the other way, too willing to accept the terms of them, it is a situation in which there's shared blame.
Do you think as a result of what we have heard today, that will change?
I would like to think that the answer is yes. I do think that not so much because of what we learned today, but because of the CIA's efforts to obstruct this investigation. We learned back in the spring that the CIA had actually spied on committee staff members, monitored their computers. I think that could prompt, drive a little daylight to between the overseers and the agencies that they are overseeing.
Of course, Senator Feinstein will not be the head of the committee come the new year. The Republicans take over as the majority party in the Senate. The Republican Richard Burr will be the head of the Intelligence Committee, and the Republicans have withdrawn from the process of releasing this report. So that suggests that all will not be plain sailing?
Certainly not in the short term. I think this is a long-term battle for the intelligence committees to really reassert themselves and to start to perform in a more robust way their constitutional functions of oversight. That's a long-term prospect. In the short term, unfortunately, I think the prospects are fairly dim, in part because the chair of the committee is on record as saying that nothing the Intelligence Committee does should ever be discussed publicly. It's going to be up to a minority within the Intelligence Committee to try to make their oversight effective in the coming years.
And does the current context complicate things? A lot of people at the CIA side today are saying you have to take what happened in the early 2000s in the context of post 9/11, and now there is a huge threat, global threat, they would argue direct threat to the United States from the so-called Islamic State. Does that complicate efforts for greater oversight?
As a political matter, it might. But in terms of the actual issues, it really shouldn't complicate matters. In fact, it should go the other way. Because what this report shows is that giving the CIA this leeway and having the CIA operate without oversight, essentially, was not only useful intelligence, but actually quite harmful to the national security of other agencies, to the standing of the United States across the world. It said financial and non-financial costs, which are cataloged in this report, that the national security imperative makes it all the more important that Congress be exercised.
Both there to Professor Elizabeth Goatee, the Director of the National Security Program at New York University's Brennan Center for Justice. You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm James Kumarasamy, and this is News Hour.
The war that changed the world on the BBC World Service. I'm Amanda Whitson. Join me and my guests in Paris for the next War That Changed the World event. How did traditions of duty, sacrifice and honor survive on the front lines?
Enter the war without French panache, and after a few months, soldiers realized that many women are earning a lot more money than soldiers are paid, so there's a huge gap.
What meaning do your historians want to give us to young people like me about World War I?
We're discussing the extraordinary impact the First World War placed on men and women. The war that changed the world from France. Online at bbcworldservice.com.
Form before strength.
Coming up on News Out in the next 30 minutes, political concerns in Greece, spooking the financial markets, teaching kids to recognise corruption in Liberia, a change of Russian rhetoric on Ukraine, but is President Putin looking to match words with actions? And why is Rwanda bidding adieu to the French flag? You're listening to the BBC World Service. James Kumarasamy with News Hour. Now a summary of the latest world news.
BBC News. US senators have condemned the CIA's use of extreme interrogation methods following the September the 11th attacks, saying in some cases they amounted to torture. A long-awaited Senate report said techniques such as sleep deprivation, waterboarding, beatings and humiliation were brutal and ineffective, providing no useful information. The senator who led the trial said the findings will stain America's history and values. European and US financial markets have fallen sharply amid continuing political instability in Greece. The stock market plunged 10% in response to news of an early vote for choosing its president, raising doubts about whether Greece will stick to an international bailout. The United Nations Refugee Agency says Western countries have promised to increase the number of Syrian refugees in Africa to 100,000. This is a significant rise from the current figure, but would still be a tiny proportion of the total number of Syrian refugees. Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe has sacked his Vice President, Joyce Mujuru, and at least 7 other ministers following a power struggle in the ruling elite. Mrs. Mujuru has strongly denied corruption. The Kenyan government has ordered the television network Al Jazeera to into investigation and face possible charges over a report it aired alleging that Kenyan police operate death squads. The government in Nairobi described the document as scandalous outcome. The US citizen has been indicted in Israel on weapons charges amid concern that he may have posed a threat to Muslim holy sites. The Justice Ministry said the man, Adam Adric-Livitz, had acquired some explosive material. And the International Olympic Committee has officially recognised Kosovo as a member. It means the former Serbian province can enter a team in the 2016 Games in Rio de Janeiro. BBC News.
Coming up next on the programme, it's about corruption in Liberia. Also, our daily look at the world of business. And it's the return of Greek uncertainty as a factor in the world's financial markets, because European and American markets are moving sharply today with continued uncertainty about the political situation in Greece. The concern is that the country may be heading for a political crisis which could jeopardise its bailout programme. Tommy Stubbington has been following the story for the Wall Street Journal.
The Athens main stock exchange fell by 13%, was wiped off the value of companies there. More broadly, we've seen falls of over 2% in broader European stocks, and this is spread into the US as well. It's been a pretty shocking day in the markets.
Why are they so concerned?
Well, the immediate trigger for this concern is a vote brought forward by the Greek government on a new president. Now, usually this is just a ceremonial position, but it's being used by the opposition. If the fails to scrape together enough parliamentary votes to appoint for the general election next year. Now, the reason that's of such great concern to the market is currently prosperity and under the next Syriza, which is quite very concerned to the market. We could see some sort of showdown between Greece and the EU.
And it's purely political, is it?
Well, I mean, certainly it's largely political at this point, the risks that investors are factoring, but that is certainly related to the state of the economy, as I say, the ongoing slump in Greece's economy, and also more broadly the Eurozone economy is not doing especially well. We're in a situation where a lot of investors are really banking on the European Central Bank stepping in to do a program of quantitative easing, much like what the Fed in the US or the Bank of England in the UK have already done in order to effectively prop up financial markets and try and recovery.
Scenario if the left-wing Syriza party gets into power that the markets are so concerned about?
Well, most immediately, it's really a showdown between Syriza and the EU over the terms of the bailout and Greece's efforts to exit its bailout programme. Syriza is a very strongly anti-austerity party, and in an effort to rein in the budget over the last few years, Greek governments have imposed very deep cuts. These are very unpopular, and a lot of the disagreement over negotiations recently has been Brussels saying to Athens, you haven't made enough cuts, and the government is desperately trying. We're talking about some fairly policies that are proposing, such as writing off debt, bailout, increasing government spending, in recent years. All of these sectors are very squarely with religion and the
Tommy Stubbington of the Wall Street Journal. He was saying markets in the United States and Europe have been hit by that knock-on effect of the Greek market slump, the FTSE in London, Germany's DAX index and the CAC 40 of France all down at least 2%. You're listening to News Hour from the BBC World Service. You're listening to News Hour from the BBC World Service. I'm James Kamara Thomas, and today is International Anti-Corruption Day. This year's theme is Great applies that change came into the News Hour studio to tell me what the idea from.
People were selling scholarships to the highest bidder. And there was one particular case in which 4 young men, 18 years old, had forged their national identity eligible for the scholarship. But what struck me was they believed fundamentally that they were in the right, that they were going to get away with it because the system was structured in such a way that they could. In experiencing this, I realized that we can't wait until they're adolescents to grow scruples. We really have to start at a much younger age. And the seeds of Bagba, my book, had been planted at that particular instance.
Tell us the story of Bagba.
The story follows a few days in the lives of Sunday Ma and Sunday Gal, who leave their hometown of Buchanan in Liberia to visit an aunt in Monrovia. And a number of encounters they have remind them of a word called Bagba, which loosely translated in the Bassa language means trickery. And so one instance, to give you a little bit of flavor of the book, one instance, they are in a very long line of traffic, and their aunt, who happens to be a government minister, basically gives the traffic police officer a bit of money to bypass the traffic lines, and they are immediately concerned about this. They start to question, why is it that this police officer has given them the opportunity to bypass a line when they've been taught that you're supposed to stand in a queue and serve your time. So these are children who are incredibly precocious. I modeled them after my nephew, who's 9 years old, in Liberia, because he asks a lot of questions. He's someone who doesn't take anything to his father, doesn't take no questions, and wants to know why. I think so, because I've had conversations with my nephew Courage, and he's very aware of what corruption means. Children are aware. I mean, I'll give you an example. When the book was published in February 2013, I did a series of readings with schools. And I asked the children, even before reading the book, have you heard of the word corruption? Do you know what it means? And they were giving me instances in which so they're very aware. The characters are meant to be heroes and heroines for the children of Liberia. And they're meant to sort of giving them an opportunity to the behavior of Sunday Ma and Sunday Gal, who clearly understand the difference between right and wrong in the story and pinpoint instances of corruption. So I think having these characters modeled after them will give them an opportunity to start questioning some of the confusing ethical codes of the adults around them.
You must have had feedback from kids in Liberia. What are they saying about the book?
They love the story. I think they also like the fact that they can relate to the story, that the street signs are familiar to them. The food that I talk about in the story are familiar to them. The names of the children are familiar to them.
Is that unusual?
It is unusual. In Liberia particularly, we don't have a children's book industry. We don't have a lot of stories that are written for and about children in the country.
Of course, kids these days don't just get information from the page, do they? There are other forms of media. Is this working in conjunction with others?
Sure. We also reach a wider audience. So I commissioned Kakumde, who is Nigeria's premier hip-hop artist, musician, very well known in the country, to produce and write a song. And he did. And the song is called Bagba is Corruption.
Bagba is getting too much. Say no to corruption, you'll be alright.
Do you know what the president thinks of the book? Has she read it?
She has. I gave her a personal copy when the book was published. I autographed a copy for her and I delivered it to her, and she thought it was fantastic.
But what does she think of the music? That was the author of Bagba the book, Robert L. There's been declared a day of silence by the Ukrainian government. Hostilities are meant to cease in the war-torn east of the country. There have been 3 previous days of silence since fighting broke out with pro-Russian rebels earlier on this year. Each of them, though, has been followed by the deafening sound of shelling as fighting and killing has continued. But could things be different this time? Well, a new round of peace talks is scheduled to take place in the Belarusian capital Minsk this week, and President Putin of Russia seems to be adopting a slightly softer rhetorical attitude towards Kiev. According to Time magazine, the Russian leader dropped a reference to the mass destruction of their own citizens by the Ukrainian authorities in a speech he gave at the Kremlin last week. Gleb Pavlovsky, the former Kremlin advisor who worked with Vladimir Putin until 2011.
Не надо придавать этому какое-то роковое значение.
I don't think that we need to attach too much to it. I'm sure that he will talk about Ukraine again. Perhaps he simply didn't want to push this topic during his last speech. But what we are seeing is a reduction in anti-Ukrainian propaganda, and that is connected with an attempt to limit, to a degree, its obsession with Ukraine, and that all current problems are related to the unrest in the Donbass region. Putin doesn't like this, and it's now led to a real political freeze. But after so much anti-Ukrainian news, people aren't prepared to simply switch from hearing, yesterday all your problems are related to Ukraine, but today workplace productivity is to blame. That wouldn't and couldn't happen. We don't live in a Stalin-esque society anymore. But Putin is trying to dial down propaganda.
Does that mean that he's also trying to de-escalate what is happening in reality? The escalation of the propaganda, does that translate to real de-escalation of the situation?
It's a real propaganda de-escalation. Also political, because he has changed how we work in Ukraine. Less military work. Also now limited to acknowledging their existence as autonomous regions, independent of Kiev, but nothing more than that. The problem is that Putin doesn't have full control of the leaders of these regions, and they don't often listen to him. Attempts to build up a reliable political leadership plan.
Can I ask, if he doesn't have full control over what's happening, that's something in private he would admit or say to Western leaders?
Putin все время говорит об этом, по-моему, ему.
Putin has always said that he doesn't have control, but Western leaders didn't believe him. They've always said to him that he has a hand in the events. It was, of course, not true. He can't control what's going on.
But he can control the message that is being sent in Russia. If he is doing that, if there is less anti-Ukrainian propaganda, is it too late in a way? Have there not been months and months of descriptions of Ukrainians as fascists? Is that not what the Russian public now believes?
Конечно, можно говорить о том, что многое уже сделано.
Of course, you can say that a lot has already been said, and that is irreversible. What people understand now is that there is a lot of support for Putin because he has taken a nationalist position. He's a Russian nationalist, and he's prepared to back this position with force. People really like this, and just aren't prepared to hear Putin talking about general diplomatic solutions. If they see and hear a Putin that is too nice, I'm worried that the population could turn away from him. This is exactly what he will be afraid of, and I think that today he's trying to regulate the situation, trying to turn down the volume. But so far, it hasn't really happened on the ground. Putin needs to find another cause that the masses support. The problem is, he doesn't know what that is. Also, Putin wants to position himself.
Now, there are 3 official languages in Rwanda: local language, Kinyarwanda, French, language of the old Belgian colonial masters, and English. In recent weeks, President Paul Kagame has shown good preference for the latter, constitution in 2002 to include English. Now the opposition are saying that it's gone too far. The Green Party filed a lawsuit in court challenging the diminishing use of French. It's really tattooed the French language in the former Belgian was run as Paris was essentially about Africa and wonder. Gerard Prunier, how widely spoken is French?
But I would say to some degree half the population does speak French.
Is it really in danger?
People will keep using it, especially with the Congo and Burundi next door, which are also French-speaking. No, they will keep using it.
So why is the Green Party taking this measure then?
All kinds of reasons. One is the use of language in official documents and as part of the administration of civil service and so on, which is not the same as the common, use of French in the street or in the market. The other thing is that French is now very recently suddenly jumped forward in terms of a politically loaded language. It was already in the past because the French tried to support or did support the government that Paul Kagame and the RPF was fighting. So there is, it's the language of the enemy. But now, what is happening in Burkina Faso and all the vibrations that the fall of Blaise Compaoré have sent throughout French-speaking Africa, it's really like what was happening with the Arab Spring.
So the language, the French language, is something of a political tool. What is the relationship that Rwanda has at the moment with French-speaking countries?
Well, middling. They have a forced relationship with Kinshasa because it is next door. They have had so many problems with them. But you could say that Kagame is Uganda. He came to Uganda when he was 4 years to 3. And then he came back when he was a grown man in his 30s. He grew up in Uganda, grew up with English language, and everything French to him is foreign. He tried to learn French. He speaks broken French, but he never could. When you're older, it's harder to learn languages.
But is this changing the language issue?
No, it's not. What happens is that the English language is clearly marked as the foreign Tutsi input. Because even the Tutsi inside Rwanda, although most of them are now dead because of the genocide, but they didn't speak English. It was purely a thing of some of the exiles, and mostly the Ugandan exiles, which are now like a kind of sub-tribe, which has superimposed itself on Rwanda, and they are running the whole thing.
We have to leave it there. You're listening to News Out from the BBC. Coming up later on the BBC Witness. Today we go back to 1995, track research from ERCA2, the most famous
when you see the statistics of the women in the family group, it was very alarming. Some of them early 20s, up to 30.
And how old were you at that point?
I was 31.